Never judge a book by its cover because you may just find yourself eating your words. It was a crisp Monday morning when Malcolm Pierce, a man in his early 30s, walked into the lobby of his own office building, a building he had invested years of sweat and tears into. But today he wasn't feeling the usual excitement of owning a successful company. Instead, there was a heavy sense of frustration and worse, humiliation. As he entered the building's lobby, the company secretary, Mrs. Caldwell, a woman in her late 50s with graying hair, sharp glasses, and a posture that screamed authority, was sitting at the reception desk. She didn't even look up as Malcolm walked in. "Good morning, Mrs. Caldwell," Malcolm greeted with a polite smile, his voice carrying the usual professionalism he was known for. "Can I help you, sir?" Mrs. Caldwell's voice was curt, condescending, like she was speaking to a complete stranger, a nobody. Malcolm's brow furrowed slightly, taken aback by her tone. "I'm here for a meeting with the board members." Without a second glance, Mrs. Caldwell responded, "We don't allow visitors without appointments. You'll need to leave and schedule a meeting first." For a moment, Malcolm paused, confused. This wasn't right. He had been in this building countless times, sitting in meetings, discussing company matters, running the business. But today there was no recognition. She didn't seem to recognize him at all. "I think you misunderstand, Mrs. Caldwell," he said, trying to maintain his calm. "I'm actually the owner of the company, Malcolm Pierce." She looked up at him slowly, sizing him up with a cold, skeptical gaze. She didn't smile, didn't flinch. "You, the owner?" She smirked, clearly doubtful. "I don't think so. There's no way. You'll need to leave the premises immediately." Malcolm's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't believe it. Mrs. Caldwell, who had worked for the company for over a decade, was refusing him access to his own building, treating him like an intruder. His frustration grew, but he kept his voice steady. "I assure you I'm not leaving. I'm the owner of this company and I'm here for a reason. Now, let me in or I'll be forced to involve someone higher up." But Mrs. Caldwell wasn't having it. Her expression hardened, and she stood up from her chair, placing her hands firmly on the desk as if preparing for a confrontation. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one last time to leave. You're not welcome here unless you have an appointment." Malcolm stood there, still in disbelief, trying to process the absurdity of the situation. How could she not recognize him? How could someone with such seniority who had worked for the company for years not know who he was? And then it hit him. She wasn't just refusing him access to the building. No, this was more than that. She was disrespecting him, belittling him because of the color of his skin. It was racism, pure and simple. She had made a judgment based on his appearance, assuming he couldn't possibly be the owner. After all, a man like him, black, dressed in a modest suit, couldn't possibly own a multimillion-dollar company in her eyes. Her attitude reeked of racial profiling, a judgment based on nothing more than her own prejudices. Malcolm's anger bubbled up, but his eyes narrowed as he took in her smug, superior expression. What was even more infuriating was that he had worked with Mrs. Caldwell for years. She knew him, knew his qualifications, knew the sweat he had poured into building this company from the ground up. Yet here she was, refusing to acknowledge him. He took a deep breath, trying to keep calm, but before he could respond, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and saw a message from his business partner, Sarah. "Malcolm, something's wrong with Mrs. Caldwell today. She's acting strange. Are you there?" That was all it took. The disbelief and humiliation turned into something darker. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a calculated act of discrimination. Malcolm felt the anger begin to burn inside of him, his heart pounding in his chest. What would happen next? Would he be forced to call the police? Was this the moment his career would take a massive hit, all because of one person's refusal to see him for who he really was? Before he could take another step, Mrs. Caldwell stood up abruptly, her eyes flashing with defiance. "I'm calling security. Leave now or I will have you removed." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. As Malcolm stood there in the middle of the lobby, fighting to keep his composure, the sharp sting of humiliation ran deep. He had to make a decision. A decision that would not only change the course of his day, but potentially alter his entire future. Was he going to back down and allow this injustice to slide? Or was he going to take a stand not just for himself, but for every person who had ever been marginalized because of their skin color? What would happen next? That was the moment that would change everything. If you want to find out what happens next and how this situation unfolds, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell notification so you won't miss the continuation of this incredible journey. The coldness of Mrs. Caldwell's voice echoed in Malcolm's mind as she made the threat to call security. He stood there in the lobby, his hands balled into fists at his sides. Every muscle in his body tensed, not from fear, but from the deep frustration and anger that boiled inside of him. How could she do this? How could she, someone who had worked for the company for so long, someone who should have known him, treat him like this? Was it really about the color of his skin? Malcolm stood frozen for a few moments, feeling the weight of the situation. He had a meeting scheduled with the board members, and he had spent the entire morning preparing. His reputation was at stake. The progress he had worked so hard for was on the line, and now here he was in his own building, being treated like an intruder. Mrs. Caldwell's eyes never wavered from him as she walked over to the phone on the reception desk. Her fingers tapped against the receiver as she spoke to the security guard, the words slicing through the air like a dagger. "I've got an issue here," she said, her tone dripping with disdain. "There's a man causing a disturbance. He says he's the owner, but I don't believe him. I need you to remove him from the building." Malcolm's chest tightened. It was as if his very existence was being dismissed, as if his identity meant nothing. The feeling of being invisible, of being denied the respect he deserved, was suffocating. But there was something else. Something deeper. A fire that had started to burn inside him, pushing him to take action. He wasn't just angry anymore. He was done being underestimated. Done being told what he was and wasn't capable of, based solely on his skin color. "I'm not going anywhere," Malcolm said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity. Mrs. Caldwell didn't respond, her focus still on the phone as she gave directions to the security guard. She didn't care. She didn't care that he was the owner of the company. She didn't care about his years of hard work. All that mattered to her was that a black man, one who didn't fit her idea of what a company owner should look like, was standing before her, and in her mind he was nothing more than an outsider. Malcolm felt the heat rise in his face as his patience thinned. He was now caught in an impossible situation. If he stayed, he risked being forcibly removed from the building, humiliated in front of the entire staff. But if he left now, Mrs. Caldwell would win. She would have proven that her assumption about him had been right all along. She'd have the upper hand and the racial profiling would go unchallenged. And then, in a split second, it hit him. He wasn't going to let her win. He wasn't going to back down. "You don't know who I am," he said, his voice rising slightly. "And you don't know what I've accomplished. But I'm here to remind you that I own this company. And I won't be treated like this." He turned toward the elevator, determined to bypass Mrs. Caldwell's roadblock and go straight to the boardroom. The decision was made. He was done being subjected to her ignorance, and he wasn't going to stand for this racist behavior any longer. But before he could take another step, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed behind him. Malcolm turned around to see a tall, imposing security guard, standing in front of him, blocking his path. The guard's eyes scanned him, and for a moment, Malcolm could see the suspicion in his gaze. The security guard looked at Mrs. Caldwell, who nodded toward him. It was clear the situation had escalated to a point where there was no going back. The guard stepped forward, towering over Malcolm. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave, sir," he said in a low, almost bored voice, as though this was just another routine request to him. Malcolm stared up at the security guard, his blood boiling. He couldn't believe this was happening. He had worked tirelessly to build this company from the ground up, and here he was, being treated like a criminal, like a second-class citizen. All because of the color of his skin. "You don't know who I am," Malcolm said again, his voice now harder, more resolute. The guard's face remained impassive. "Doesn't matter. Mrs. Caldwell says you need to leave. I'm just doing my job." This was it. This was the moment. He had to make a choice. Malcolm felt his hands tighten into fists. He wasn't about to let this go. Not this time. "Call Sarah," he said, his voice growing louder, demanding action. "I'm the owner. She knows who I am. If you don't let me through, I'll be forced to take legal action." The security guard hesitated for a second, unsure of what to do. Malcolm knew he had no choice but to escalate this, to fight back, to make them understand. He wasn't just going to sit here and take it. The guard's phone vibrated in his pocket and he pulled it out, his eyes scanning the screen. He looked up at Malcolm with a hint of uncertainty, as though he was beginning to doubt his orders. But before the guard could make any move, Mrs. Caldwell spoke again, her voice dripping with authority. "Forget it," she snapped, turning to the security guard. "He's wasting our time. Call the police." The words sent a chill through Malcolm's body. The police? They were going to call the police on him? On the owner of the company? The injustice of it all hit him like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just about this single encounter anymore. It was about the system. It was about how people like him, people who had worked hard, achieved success, were still treated as lesser beings because of the color of their skin. Malcolm stood there, his pulse racing. What was he supposed to do now? What would happen when the police arrived? How far was Mrs. Caldwell willing to go to prove that she was right, that a black man couldn't possibly be in charge of a company like this? The tension was unbearable. Malcolm knew that in that moment, everything was about to change. The words "call the police" hung in the air like a thunderclap, the weight of them crashing into Malcolm's chest. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead, but it wasn't fear he was feeling. No, it was something far more suffocating: humiliation. How was this happening? How had everything gone so wrong? Mrs. Caldwell was staring at him now, her face a mix of triumph and condescension, as if she'd just won some sort of silent victory. Her lips curled into a smirk, and Malcolm saw in that look everything he had feared. He was being judged, not by his actions, not by his qualifications, but by the simple fact that he was black. The security guard, still looming in front of him, pulled out his phone. Malcolm's fists clenched at his sides as he stood frozen, paralyzed by the realization that there was nothing he could do to stop it. He wasn't going to leave. He wasn't going to back down. But as he saw the guard's fingers press the digits to dial the police, the hopelessness of the situation set in. "Sir, we're not going to argue with you anymore," the security guard said, his voice mechanical. "You need to leave the building now, or we will have you escorted out in handcuffs." Malcolm's breath hitched in his throat. He wanted to yell, to scream, to show them how wrong they were, how absurd this entire situation was. But instead, he stood still, fighting back the tears that threatened to sting his eyes. His pride, his dignity were on the line. This wasn't just about getting into the boardroom anymore. This was about something much larger than that, something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Don't you dare," Malcolm said, his voice quiet, yet dripping with authority. "I own this company. I've built it from the ground up. And you want to have me thrown out like some criminal? You want to make me a spectacle? For what? Because you can't see beyond my skin?" Mrs. Caldwell's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she gave a subtle nod to the security guard, signaling him to continue his call. There was no remorse in her eyes, no hint of self-awareness. To her, this was simply a matter of procedure, a black man claiming to be the owner? Preposterous. Seconds later, the cold sound of sirens echoed through the street outside. The police were on their way. Malcolm could hear the distant sound of their engines approaching, and a tight knot formed in his stomach. The building around him seemed to close in. He wasn't just fighting to be recognized as the owner of his own business. He was fighting to be seen as a human being. This wasn't just a clash between two individuals. It was a battle between generations of prejudice, systemic racism that had been embedded deep in society for far too long. The door to the lobby swung open with a force that made Malcolm jump, and two uniformed officers walked in, their presence intimidating and cold. They looked at Malcolm, not with curiosity but with suspicion. They were trained to respond to threats, to deal with confrontations, but this wasn't a normal situation. They weren't walking into a typical dispute. They were walking into a racial conflict, one that neither of them seemed prepared for. "Can I help you, officers?" Mrs. Caldwell asked sweetly, her tone sugary, almost sickening in its falseness. She was playing her role perfectly, Malcolm thought bitterly, playing the role of the innocent woman who needed protection, while he was painted as the troublemaker, the threat. One of the officers, a tall man with dark hair and a stern face, turned his attention to Malcolm. He seemed to size him up with a glance, his eyes flicking over Malcolm's appearance the same way Mrs. Caldwell had. Malcolm's suit, his black leather shoes, his neatly pressed shirt, all of it didn't matter. The officer was only seeing one thing, a black man standing in front of him. "Sir," the officer said, his voice cool but authoritative, "we've been called here because of a disturbance. You need to leave the building immediately." Malcolm's mind raced, his pulse pounding in his ears. This was the moment he had been dreading. The officers were here, and they were acting like he was the one who was in the wrong, like he was the one who needed to be controlled, removed, erased. "You don't have to do this," Malcolm said, trying to remain calm, but his voice was shaking now. "I own this building. I own this company. Mrs. Caldwell here is refusing me entry because she doesn't believe I'm who I say I am. She thinks I'm just some random guy off the street." The officer's face remained neutral, but there was a flicker of something, disbelief perhaps. The other officer, a younger woman, glanced at her partner and then back at Malcolm, her gaze somewhat softer, though not sympathetic. "Is that true, ma'am?" The male officer asked Mrs. Caldwell, as though he was giving her a chance to explain herself. He hadn't even looked at Malcolm's ID, hadn't asked to confirm his story. He had already made up his mind. Mrs. Caldwell was quick to nod, putting on her best victimized face. "Yes, officer. This man has been disruptive from the moment he arrived. He's causing a scene, making threats. I don't feel safe around him." Malcolm was stunned. It was almost laughable, the way she was spinning the story to paint him as the villain. A villain who just happened to be black. The officer turned back to Malcolm, his eyes hardening. "Sir, we have to ask you to leave. You are trespassing. If you refuse, we will be forced to arrest you." "Arrest him?" The words hit Malcolm like a slap. Arrest him for nothing. For existing, for daring to show up as the person who he was, someone deserving of respect, of dignity. The anger boiled in his chest now, hot and uncontrollable. His hands shook with fury, but deep inside there was also something else. A feeling of helplessness that was suffocating him. He stood there, staring at the officer, who still hadn't made an effort to question Mrs. Caldwell's side of the story, and a slow realization crept over him. This wasn't just a one-off misunderstanding. This wasn't just some isolated incident. This was the reality of racism in America. It wasn't a shadowy figure in the background, it was a system. It was people like Mrs. Caldwell, people like the officers, who saw him as less than, who saw his value only in the color of his skin. And as the officers began to move toward him, signaling that his time in the lobby had run out, Malcolm knew that he had to make a choice, one that would affect the rest of his life. Would he let this injustice slide? Or would he fight even if it meant putting everything he had worked for at risk? But before he could make that choice, something unexpected happened. The weight of the situation pressed down on Malcolm, as if the walls of the building were closing in around him. He could feel his heart racing in his chest, the air thick with tension, the stares of Mrs. Caldwell and the officers burning into him like a spotlight. It felt as if the entire world was against him. The male officer took a step closer, his hand reaching for his belt, the faintest movement that made Malcolm's breath catch. His mind spun in a frenzy. Was he really about to be arrested for simply existing? For walking into his own office building? Sir, the officer's voice was cold and unyielding. I'm giving you one last chance to leave without any further trouble. Malcolm's mind was racing, but his body remained still. He had to make a decision. He had been a law-abiding citizen his whole life, doing everything by the book, playing by the rules. But in this moment, those rules felt like shackles, keeping him bound to a system that had always treated him like less. What was happening wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. It wasn't just an isolated incident of an overzealous security guard. No, it was something much deeper. This was racism. This was the ingrained prejudice that people like Mrs. Caldwell didn't even see because it was so normalized, so institutionalized. But Malcolm wasn't going to let this go quietly. He couldn't. Not this time. He stood taller, meeting the officer's gaze. I'm not leaving, he said, his voice firm, no longer shaking with uncertainty. I'm the owner of this company. I'm not going anywhere, not until I'm treated with respect. The officer blinked, clearly taken aback by Malcolm's defiance. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, the air growing thicker with the clash of wills. Mrs. Caldwell stood off to the side, her arms crossed, a smug expression still plastered across her face. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected Malcolm to stand up for himself. You're not leaving? The officer's voice was incredulous. We're telling you to leave and you refuse? Malcolm didn't back down. I refuse to leave because I'm the one being treated unfairly. I'm the one being judged based on the color of my skin, not my identity, not my accomplishments. The officer hesitated, and for a brief moment, it seemed like he might actually consider what Malcolm was saying. But then the young female officer spoke up, her voice sharp as if her patience had run out. Look, sir, we're not here to get into some philosophical debate with you. You're causing a disruption and we've been called here to handle this. Either you leave now or you'll be arrested for trespassing. Trespassing. Malcolm's stomach churned at the word. He was the one who had been wronged, but here he was, being painted as the criminal. And the worst part? The officer wasn't even questioning it. He wasn't asking why this was happening or considering the possibility that there was more to the story than what Mrs. Caldwell had told him. He was simply following orders, following the same outdated, discriminatory script that too many people like him had followed before. Malcolm's mind raced, but then he remembered something. He remembered a conversation he had had years ago with Sarah, his business partner. They had talked about the fight for equality, about how things had to change, how they had to make their voices heard, even when the world seemed determined to silence them. He wasn't going to back down. Not today. Not in front of these people who had reduced him to nothing more than his skin color. I'm not going anywhere, he repeated, his voice now a low, steady growl. But I am calling my lawyer. I'm going to make sure that this injustice doesn't go unchallenged. The male officer's face hardened at his words. You think that's going to change anything? He sneered. You're just making things harder for yourself. Malcolm's eyes locked onto the officers, and in that moment, he felt a surge of power. He wasn't the one in the wrong here. He wasn't the one who had made a judgment about another human being simply based on their race. You don't get to decide that for me, Malcolm said, his voice unwavering. I'll make sure everyone knows what's going on here. I'll make sure that the world knows what you and your colleagues are doing. And trust me, it won't end well for you. There was a tense silence, thick with the weight of his words. The officers exchanged a quick glance, but neither of them moved. And then, as if on cue, A new voice broke through the tension. "Malcolm?" It was Sarah's voice. She had arrived. Sarah walked into the lobby with the same confidence that had helped them build the company together. When Mrs. Caldwell saw her, the smirk that had once seemed so confident now faltered, replaced with a look of unease. "What's going on here?" Sarah asked, her gaze quickly assessing the situation. She glanced at the officers, then at Mrs. Caldwell, and finally, her eyes locked onto Malcolm. "They're trying to throw me out of my own building," Malcolm said, his voice a mix of frustration and anger. "Because Mrs. Caldwell doesn't believe I'm the owner. She's refusing me entry, and now they've called the police." Sarah's eyes narrowed as she took in the full scope of the situation. She was smart, calculating, and she wasn't about to let this go unchallenged. "You called the police on him?" Sarah asked Mrs. Caldwell, her voice sharp, demanding answers. "You called the police because you couldn't recognize him?" Mrs. Caldwell's face flushed a deep red, but she refused to back down. "I wasn't sure who he was," she said, her voice laced with thinly veiled defensiveness. "And he was being disruptive." "Disruptive?" Sarah repeated, incredulous. "He was trying to get into his office." "His office? And you're calling that disruptive? For what? Because he's black?" The room fell silent. Sarah's words cut through the tension like a knife, and Malcolm could see the smallest crack in Mrs. Caldwell's defense. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to undo the harm that had already been done. The officers, clearly caught in the middle, looked between the three of them, uncertain of how to proceed. The younger female officer cleared her throat. "Ma'am, sir, we need to take a step back here," she said, glancing at her partner. "Maybe we should take a moment to figure out what's really going on." But the damage was already done. They had already made up their minds. Malcolm knew that the rest of this battle wasn't going to be fought here in the lobby. It wasn't going to be solved with a simple conversation. This was bigger than a single instance. This was about systemic racism, about fighting for justice in a world that was built to suppress people like him. And no matter what happened next, he wasn't going to let this moment pass without a fight. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating, as Sarah stood beside Malcolm, both of them glaring at Mrs. Caldwell and the officers who had now become mere bystanders in a battle they were too blind to understand. The moment Sarah had spoken, it was as if a shift had occurred. The officer who had been in charge of the situation now seemed uncertain, his gaze flickering back and forth between the three of them. The female officer remained silent, her face unreadable, though Malcolm could sense the discomfort building between them. "Ma'am, sir, let's just take a step back, okay?" The male officer finally spoke, his voice cautious, as if unsure of how to proceed in this uncomfortable situation. "No," Sarah's voice rang out, firm and unwavering. "You're not going to stand here and pretend you don't see what's happening. You're treating my business partner like a criminal because of his skin color. He's the owner of this company. You should be respecting him, not forcing him to prove his worth over and over again." Malcolm stood beside her, a quiet fire burning in his chest. He hadn't realized until this moment how much it had affected him, how deep this racism had cut. He had built everything with his own hands, his sweat, his blood, his countless sleepless nights. But none of that seemed to matter to Mrs. Caldwell, to these officers. In their eyes, he was still just another black man, a threat that didn't belong in spaces he had earned. "Why are you doing this?" Malcolm's voice cracked with frustration as he directed his question toward the female officer, who was still standing at a distance. "Why are you choosing to believe her? Is this how you treat all your disruptive black customers? Is this how the law works now? We get treated like criminals just because we don't fit into the mold you've created?" The female officer took a step back as though she hadn't expected this kind of response. For a moment, she seemed to be wrestling with her own internal conflict. Perhaps for the first time, she was considering the reality of what was happening. But it didn't matter. The damage had already been done. Meanwhile, Mrs. Caldwell, who had been standing off to the side, silent but furious, now turned her eyes on Sarah, her lips curled in contempt. "Your partner here is causing chaos, and now you're encouraging it," Mrs. Caldwell sneered. "You really think this is going to end well for you both? Maybe you should take your hands off this situation before it gets worse." Sarah's jaw tightened, but she didn't flinch. "I'm not going anywhere until you understand that this is racism. Straight up. You've looked at Malcolm, and you've decided that he doesn't belong here, that he doesn't have the right to walk into his own building. But you know what? You're wrong." A cold silence filled the room as Malcolm looked between Sarah and the officers, both of whom had now fallen silent. The reality of what Sarah had said was starting to sink in, and that sting of racial injustice Malcolm had felt before now turned into a powerful sense of resolve. It wasn't just about him anymore, It was about every black man and woman who had been denied their place in this world simply because of how they looked. But just as the silence became unbearable, Mrs. Caldwell's next words shattered the moment. "Enough of this," she hissed, turning toward the officers. "I'm calling corporate. I'm going to make sure both of you are fired. Don't you dare think you can walk away from this. You will regret standing here and letting this man intimidate you." The venom in her voice was enough to make Malcolm's stomach churn. It was clear that she wasn't going to back down. This wasn't just about her refusing to recognize Malcolm's authority as the owner. No, this was about power, about control, and about her needing to be right at all costs. Her words lingered in the air, and Malcolm's face flushed with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Here she was, making it about her own bruised ego, threatening to punish the officers, not because they were wrong, but because they hadn't immediately sided with her. But then, something unexpected happened. The male officer, who had been standing at attention and taking Mrs. Caldwell's words without question, hesitated. A flicker of doubt crossed his face. His eyes shifted back toward Malcolm, then Sarah, and for the first time he seemed to question his role in this. "Ma'am," he said, his voice no longer as sharp, "maybe we should take a moment to look at this differently. We may have misunderstood the situation. This isn't just about who belongs here. It's about respecting the people who built this place." The words hung in the air as if time had stopped for a second. The officer's partner, the younger woman, looked at him in disbelief. Clearly, this wasn't the response she had been expecting. The shift in their dynamic was palpable, but it wasn't enough to undo the damage. Malcolm felt his chest tighten as he processed the officer's words. Was this real? Was the officer actually starting to see the truth? Before he could say anything, the male officer turned his attention back to Mrs. Caldwell. "Ma'am, I think we need to reconsider the way we're handling this. This is the owner of the company, and it's clear that there's been a mistake." But Mrs. Caldwell wasn't listening. She was still shaking her head in disbelief, her lips curled in an expression of pure anger. "You can't be serious," she spat. "You're siding with him? You're going to let this man?" She couldn't even finish her sentence, her rage choking off her words. But Malcolm, now fully emboldened by the shift in the officer's attitude, took a step forward, his voice low and cutting. "Don't try to change the narrative now, Mrs. Caldwell. This isn't about who's right. This is about your refusal to acknowledge the simple truth, that you saw me and decided I didn't belong here, simply because of my skin. And that's the kind of racism that's been allowed to fester for too long in this country." There was a pause. For a moment, it seemed like Mrs. Caldwell might actually crumble under the weight of the truth. But then she snapped back, her pride too strong to let go. "You're going to regret this, Malcolm. You've made a big mistake." Malcolm locked eyes with her, his jaw set with determination. "I'll regret nothing," he said, his voice steady. "But you might." It was clear that this wasn't the end of the battle. In fact, this was just the beginning of a much larger fight, one that would involve more than just Malcolm and Mrs. Caldwell. This was about standing up to the system that had allowed people like Mrs. Caldwell to thrive while suppressing the very people who had earned their place. Malcolm wasn't going to back down. He wasn't going to let this moment pass, not when it could change everything. And as the officers stood silently, torn between doing the right thing and protecting their own positions, Malcolm knew one thing for sure: the fight had just begun. The silence in the lobby was deafening, the weight of Malcolm's words hanging in the air like a heavy cloud. The officers seemed frozen in place, as if caught in a moment of reckoning they hadn't expected to face. The entire scene felt surreal to Malcolm. He was standing in his own building with his own future at stake, and yet he had to fight just to be treated like a human being, like someone deserving of respect. Mrs. Caldwell stood there, still fuming, her arms crossed tightly across her chest, her mouth set in a hard line. She hadn't expected Malcolm to stand up to her. She hadn't expected him to fight back, to expose her for what she truly was. She had probably thought that a man like Malcolm, a black man, would just cower, would apologize for taking up space, for daring to exist in a place that she had convinced herself was hers to control. But Malcolm wasn't going anywhere. Not now. Not ever. The male officer, who had begun to show some signs of doubt, took a step toward Mrs. Caldwell. His voice was quieter now, no longer filled with the certainty that had initially marked his words. "Ma'am, I think you need to understand that what's happening here is a misunderstanding. This man is the owner of the company, and there is no reason to treat him like this. We're here to de-escalate the situation, not make it worse." Malcolm's eyes widened. Was this officer actually siding with him? Was he starting to see the truth of what was going on here? For the first time since this ordeal began, Malcolm allowed himself to feel a sliver of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could change. But then Mrs. Caldwell's response shattered that hope. "You're not doing your job," she snapped at the officer. "You're letting this man walk all over you. This is my office building, and I won't stand for this kind of insubordination. He's causing a disturbance. He doesn't belong here." Her words stung, each one a clear reminder of how deeply ingrained her racism was. She wasn't even attempting to hide it anymore. She was openly belittling Malcolm, trying to assert her authority in the only way she knew how, by pushing him down, by denying his existence and his achievements. Malcolm could feel his blood boiling again, but he didn't let the rage take over. Not this time. He was done reacting with anger. He was done letting people like Mrs. Caldwell have the power to control how he felt, how he responded. He had built a company. He had earned his place. And no amount of prejudice was going to take that away from him. "Ma'am," Malcolm said, his voice steady and calm despite the storm raging inside of him. "This is not your office. This is not your company. You do not have the right to decide who belongs here and who doesn't. You're acting on assumptions, on ignorance. You've made your judgment based solely on how I look, and you've completely disregarded the facts." Mrs. Caldwell recoiled slightly, but the sneer on her face remained. She wasn't backing down. She couldn't. Her pride wouldn't allow it. "Your tone is inappropriate," she said through gritted teeth, trying to assert some kind of control over the situation. "I'm not going to stand here and be lectured by you. Do you think you can intimidate me with your words? Do you think this is going to end well for you?" Malcolm took a deep breath. He wasn't going to let her provoke him. He wasn't going to let her control this narrative anymore. "I don't need to intimidate you," he replied, his voice firm but measured. "The truth speaks for itself. You're the one who's made the mistake here. You're the one who's treated me like I'm inferior simply because of my skin color. That's racism, pure and simple. And I won't let it slide." The officer next to him, the younger woman, finally spoke, her voice softer now, more hesitant. "I think we need to step outside for a moment, maybe talk about this with a supervisor," she said. "I can see both sides here, but I don't think we're getting anywhere with this confrontation." Malcolm glanced at her, surprised. It was the first sign of empathy he had seen from her, the first hint that she might be willing to question the way things had been handled. But Mrs. Caldwell was having none of it. "No, absolutely not," she barked, her voice shrill with panic. "You can't just stand here and let this black man, talk to me like that. You need to do your job." The words cut through the air, loud and vicious. She wasn't even trying to hide her disdain for Malcolm anymore. It was clear that she had crossed a line where her own prejudices could no longer be masked by a polite facade. Malcolm's stomach turned as he listened to her venomous words, but he didn't flinch. He wasn't going to let her reduce him to the stereotype she wanted to see. He wasn't going to let her make him feel small, weak, like he didn't belong. He turned to the officer who had shown him a sliver of respect, the one who had started to question Mrs. Caldwell's authority. "I'm not going anywhere," Malcolm said, his voice unwavering. "I'm going to make sure this company is run the way it's meant to be, on merit, on hard work, on equality. And I won't let people like Mrs. Caldwell try to destroy that." The officer nodded slowly, his face now filled with reluctant understanding. "We're going to have to resolve this," he said quietly. "But I can't ignore what's happening here. I'm going to call my supervisor and we'll get this sorted. But you're right. This is not right." For a brief moment, Malcolm allowed himself a small breath of relief. It wasn't much, but it was something. Then Mrs. Caldwell exploded. "You think you can talk to me like that and get away with it?" she shouted, her face red with rage. "I'm calling corporate right now, and when they hear about this, you'll never step foot in this building again. You'll never be in charge of anything again." Her words rang out like a final blow, and for a second, it felt like everything was crashing down. But then Malcolm realized he didn't need to fear her. He didn't need to fear her threats. Because the truth was on his side. And as the officers stepped away to make their calls, Malcolm stood tall, knowing this moment, this fight, wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The tension in the lobby could have been cut with a knife. Malcolm stood there, his arms crossed, his stance firm and unyielding, while Mrs. Caldwell fumed in the corner, her eyes blazing with contempt. The officers had moved to the side, speaking quietly to each other, their phones out, presumably calling their supervisor. Sarah stood by his side, her hand subtly brushing against his, an unspoken gesture of solidarity. It was the only thing grounding him right now. Malcolm had never felt more alone, even though Sarah was there, even though the officers had momentarily sided with him. He could feel the weight of every second, every passing moment dragging on as Mrs. Caldwell's rage simmered just below the surface. He knew she wasn't going to let this go, not after being so thoroughly confronted. This wasn't just about the company or the building anymore. This was about her pride, her need to prove that a black man couldn't possibly be the one in charge. And then, just as Malcolm thought he might finally catch a breath, the door to the lobby swung open. A man entered, a well-dressed man in his 50s with a sharp suit and an air of authority that couldn't be missed. He walked in with a confident stride, his gaze moving quickly over the scene, taking in the officers, the standoff, and then landing on Mrs. Caldwell. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, his voice smooth, calm, and commanding. "What's going on here?" Mrs. Caldwell rushed to him immediately, a look of both relief and urgency on her face. She leaned in close, whispering in his ear, and Malcolm could immediately tell this man wasn't just another employee. He was someone important, someone with power. She was telling him everything. "This man," Mrs. Caldwell began, her voice tight with barely contained anger, "is trying to cause a scene. He's not only disrupting the building, he's demanding entry into places he has no right to be. He claims to be the owner, but I know better. He doesn't belong here." The man's eyes flicked over to Malcolm, studying him for a moment. For the briefest of seconds, Malcolm saw a flicker of hesitation, a look of judgment, before the man turned back to Mrs. Caldwell. "All right, Mrs. Caldwell. I'll take it from here," the man said, his voice still smooth but edged with authority. He motioned for the officers to step aside. "Now, sir," the man began, turning his attention to Malcolm. His gaze was cold, and it felt like he was examining him, judging him as if Malcolm were somehow the problem. "Why don't you tell me what's going on here?" Malcolm opened his mouth, but he could already tell where this was headed. It was clear that the man hadn't been briefed properly. He hadn't seen the situation for what it was. This man wasn't asking for the truth. He was trying to see if he could brush this under the rug, to avoid any confrontation that would make him look bad in front of his peers. "I'm the owner of this company," Malcolm said, his voice steady, but there was an edge to it now. "And I was just trying to enter my office when I was stopped. Mrs. Caldwell refuses to acknowledge who I am, and she's been treating me like a criminal. She even called the police on me." The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned to look at Mrs. Caldwell, his eyes narrowing. Malcolm could feel the anger welling up inside of him, but he kept it in check, fighting to stay calm. He wasn't going to let this man dismiss him as easily as the others had. He wasn't going to let this become just another episode in his life where he was silenced, where his rights were trampled underfoot. "Is this true?" the man asked Mrs. Caldwell, his voice suddenly sharp. Mrs. Caldwell stood there, eyes wide with shock. She wasn't used to being challenged. She wasn't used to someone questioning her authority. But there was no way she could deny what had happened, not with the officers standing there as witnesses. "Well, yes, but," she stammered, her voice faltering. He was being unreasonable, demanding access to areas he had no right to be in. "And I—" "No," the man interrupted, his voice suddenly much more forceful. He turned to Malcolm again, his eyes softening for the first time. "I'm sorry this happened to you," he said, his voice surprisingly sincere. "It should never have gone this far. I apologize for the treatment you've received today." For a brief moment, Malcolm thought he might finally be getting through. But that moment was short-lived, as Mrs. Caldwell's next words shattered any hope Malcolm had. "That's enough," she snapped, her face now flushed with indignation. "You can't possibly be taking his side. This is a black man who's trying to take over my company. You're all letting him walk all over you, and now you're going to apologize to him?" Her words rang out like a slap in the face, loud and venomous, and Malcolm could feel the sting of every single syllable. It was as if all her hatred, all her years of quietly harboring resentment toward people like him, were pouring out in one final outburst. This wasn't just about Malcolm. It was about the deep-seated racism that had been simmering beneath the surface for years, the kind that wasn't always visible but always present. For a moment, there was a tense silence in the room. The man, the one who had first seemed sympathetic, now looked uncomfortable. The officer stood in the background, unsure of what to do next. Sarah, who had been standing quietly beside Malcolm, now stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "That's exactly what this is about, Mrs. Caldwell," she said, her words sharp but controlled. "This is about you seeing a black man, a successful black man, and assuming that he couldn't possibly own something like this. You see him and you see a threat and you're willing to do anything to try to make him disappear. But he's not going anywhere." The man looked at Sarah, and for a brief moment, Malcolm could see the flicker of something close to understanding. It wasn't a lot, but it was something. The man took a deep breath and turned back to Mrs. Caldwell. "I'm going to have a talk with you later, Mrs. Caldwell," he said, his voice now much firmer. "But for now I think we've all heard enough. I'm sorry, Mr. Pierce. I'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Malcolm felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was quickly tempered by the harsh reality of the situation. Mrs. Caldwell wasn't the only one. She was a symptom of a much larger problem, a problem that Malcolm knew would take far more than an apology to fix. But it was a start. And for once, for the first time in a long while, he felt like his voice had been heard. Malcolm stood in the silence that followed the exchange, the weight of Mrs. Caldwell's venomous words still hanging in the air, heavy and suffocating. He wasn't sure what had just happened, whether this was the end of the ordeal or simply another twist in an ongoing nightmare. But there was a moment, fleeting but powerful, where he felt a sense of relief. At least for now, someone with authority, was beginning to see him for who he was. But that relief quickly turned to dread as he saw the look in Mrs. Caldwell's eyes. The apology from the man who, he now understood, was a senior executive, might have been a step in the right direction, but it was only temporary. Mrs. Caldwell wasn't someone who would just accept defeat. No, she was someone who would fight back no matter how wrong she was. "I'll make sure you both regret this," Mrs. Caldwell spat, her voice dripping with malice. "You'll see. This won't end here. I'll make sure the entire board hears about what's happening in my building." Malcolm didn't flinch even though the words hit him like a fist. He knew she would try to use whatever power she had left to make his life miserable. It wasn't the first time he had faced resistance like this. But today it felt different. This was a direct assault on his humanity, and he wasn't going to back down. "Do what you have to do, Mrs. Caldwell," he said, his voice cold, resolute. "But you'll have to answer for your actions. I won't be silenced." The man who had apologized to him, the senior executive, stepped forward. His tone was firm but still filled with that hint of uncertainty. "Mrs. Caldwell, I need you to step aside," he said. "I will handle this from here." Her glare could have burned through steel as she stepped back, but she didn't argue. Instead, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the lobby, her heels clicking loudly against the marble floor. Malcolm could feel her rage like a palpable force, but he was done letting her control him. "Mr. Pierce," the senior executive said, turning toward Malcolm, "I want to assure you that we're taking this seriously. We'll be reviewing the situation thoroughly, and Mrs. Caldwell's actions will be addressed. What happened today was completely unacceptable, and it will not go unpunished." Malcolm nodded, his jaw tight. He didn't trust the man completely, not yet. He'd heard apologies before, seen them followed by nothing but silence and more disrespect. But something about this felt different. Maybe it was the shift in the officers' attitudes, maybe it was the fact that this man had actually acknowledged the problem. But even if it was different, Malcolm knew the battle wasn't over. Not by a long shot. "I don't want apologies," Malcolm said. His voice had a finality to it now. "I want action. I want accountability. This isn't just about me. This is about every black person who's had to fight to be seen, to be heard, to be respected. I won't be the only one suffering because of the way you let people like Mrs. Caldwell treat others. And I'm not letting it go." The senior executive's face softened, his eyes meeting Malcolm's with a quiet understanding. For a moment, it almost felt like a breakthrough, as though someone was finally hearing the truth of what Malcolm had been living not just today but for years. "I hear you," the man said. "And I promise you that this won't be swept under the rug. I'll make sure this doesn't happen again. But please understand this will take time. We have to follow the process." Malcolm's heart sank. Time. The one thing he had been given so little of in his life. Time had always been the enemy, as it had been for so many others who looked like him. The systems in place weren't designed for him to succeed. They weren't designed for anyone who looked like him to succeed. "I don't have time for excuses," Malcolm said, his voice low but powerful. "People like me don't get to sit back and wait for change to happen. We make it happen, and if you don't act quickly, I will take this higher. I'll make sure everyone knows what's really going on here." The senior executive hesitated, and for a moment, Malcolm could see the gears turning in his head. Maybe he wasn't used to this kind of challenge, not from someone like Malcolm. But there was something more, something deeper at play. This wasn't just about his company. This wasn't just about Mrs. Caldwell's hatred. This was about the whole system, the world Malcolm lived in. It was about the deep, pervasive racism that, no matter how much he fought against it, kept finding ways to creep into every corner of his life. "I understand," the man said finally. "We'll take swift action. You have my word." It wasn't much, but it was something. For now, it would have to be enough. Malcolm nodded, but as he did, a familiar sense of unease crept into his chest. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As the senior executive walked away to handle the aftermath, Sarah stepped closer to Malcolm, her hand on his arm. She didn't say anything at first, but her touch was comforting, a reminder that he wasn't alone in this. "Are you okay?" She asked quietly, her eyes filled with concern. Malcolm nodded, though it didn't feel like the truth. Yeah, he said, his voice hollow. For now I'm okay. But I'm not going to stop. Not until this is fixed. I can't. Sarah nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. She knew him well enough to know that this fight wasn't just about today. It was about a lifetime of being overlooked, being underestimated, being made to feel less than. Good, she said softly. We won't stop until things change. I promise. As they stood there, in the lobby of his own building, a building that he had built with his own blood, sweat, and tears, Malcolm knew that this was only the beginning. The fight for justice, for equality, was far from over. And even if the world tried to break him, even if the world tried to make him feel small, he would never stop. Because this wasn't just about one person's struggle. It was about the millions of people, the millions of black men and women, who had fought and struggled just to be seen, just to be heard. And Malcolm Pierce was done being invisible.